The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Disasters can destroy lives, homes, businesses, and entire communities in a matter of hours or even minutes. When disaster strikes, we actually have the opportunity to observe the economic processes which generate prosperity operate at high speed. Consequently, the recovery from disasters can often inform our understanding of economic development. Must the government lead the response to and recovery from natural disasters? Throughout much of America's history, voluntary organizations and individual efforts have assisted individuals and communities in their recovery from natural disasters. How did this happen, and are there lessons for disaster response from these examples today? Joining me on EconVersations today to discuss her research on the recovery after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 is Dr. Emily Skarbek from King's College in London. Emily earned a PhD in economics from George Mason and taught at San Jose State University before moving to England. We're very pleased for the opportunity to have her here at the Johnson Center. So welcome to Troy, Emily, and welcome to EconVersations.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So this is what we're going to be talking about today is based on some research that you've done on this topic of the Chicago Fire, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So I've published a number of papers on looking at the recovery effort after the Chicago Fire of 1871. There's a number of reasons for going about that. The historical case allows us to look at disasters from perhaps a different light than contemporary disasters. Oftentimes, when we're looking at contemporary issues, after disasters, these are ongoing recovery efforts that take a long time to fully work themselves out. By going back in time, we can look at complete recovery efforts from both sides of how the money came in after the disaster, what were the operative players, and how were they able to execute a recovery effort, and then evaluate whether or not that was a successful recovery or not.
So let's, before we get into some of the details about the recovery, why don't you refresh our memories here? Because it might have been a while since we've taken a history class and might not remember a lot of the details about the Chicago Fire. So tell us a little bit about what happened.
Yeah, so the Chicago Fire was one of the worst natural disasters in economic history in the U.S. The Chicago Fire started in October, on the evening of October, and it burned for over 72 hours. It burned the entire central city of Chicago, burning out many residential districts, but also primarily all of the business and central city district. Over 300 people were killed in the fire, and very importantly, the population of Chicago at the time was about 300,000 people. Overnight, 1/3 of the population, so over 100,000 people, were left homeless and without shelter. So it was a very dramatic event, but it happened very quickly, and it impacted really the entire urban population of Chicago.
And again, like you said, the entire central area of Chicago, what would now be inside the loop in downtown Chicago, that was all burned, right?
Yes, it was entirely leveled for the most part.
Okay, so we had this tremendous disaster, although, and I guess in a sense not completely unparalleled, because although we sort of forget this today, urban fires were actually fairly common in the United States back in the 1800s, right?
Absolutely, and there's a lot of other parallels to many different types of disasters that happened at the time. Urban fires, there were a great urban fire in Boston. These were not, this is not a unique experience to Chicago, but it allows us to see some of the dynamics of disaster response that took place prior to having an overarching federal bureaucracy that was charged with the task of recovery efforts. So it allows us to kind of go back and look at how it is various different organizations undertook these efforts on their own to try to come back after these disasters.
And in addition to fires, I mean, although the federal government started getting assisting in disasters in the 1900s, we had hurricanes and earthquakes and tornadoes in the United States long before the before the federal government started assisting in communities after disasters. And so there were recovery efforts after a lot of these other events as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And they all took they took a variety of different forms. What my research does is it tries to look at kind of the institutional specifics of how it is that voluntary organization worked after this disaster, and then in other cases look at where there might be parallels in other circumstances, or where the context of Chicago actually determines the type of organizations that people form and how they go about solving problems on the ground.
Okay, so let's get into then your research a little bit more, because although you picked the case of Chicago, explain to us why it is that you decided to pick the case of Chicago, given that there were other cities, other disasters. Was there anything sort of typical or unique about Chicago, or was there something that allowed you from a research standpoint to be able to do this study?
Yeah, so a couple of different points there. First, from a research design perspective, it was quite useful. I mean, why should we go back to the 1800s to learn about natural disasters? Well, what this allows us to do is we were able to look at archival evidence from the relief effort and actually track every single dollar of donations that came into Chicago. And they came in from all over the country and actually all over the world. But we were able to track from the archival records all of the money that came into the city, how it was spent, when it was spent, who spent it, and then to kind of look at that recovery effort from a holistic perspective. So it's really the archival evidence that allowed us to have this full picture of how the recovery effort, both in terms of the donations and revenue that were coming into the city, and then the expenditures on the relief effort and how those undertook. So that's one of the kind of research justifications for going back to the 1800s to learn about natural disasters. The second point is that at this point in history, individual and corporate level giving did not have differential tax benefits. And so what that means is that when we're looking at donations coming into a disaster, corporate giving didn't have any kind of special benefits or penalties as to individual giving. So when we look at the donations, we're looking at these from very much an apples to apples picture. In terms of trying to assess what the donations look like. Because this is important, because we want to kind of understand, well, what does voluntary charitable giving look like when it's not influenced by particular tax benefits or tax distortions. So going back to the 1800s, we can go and look at in more of an apples to apples comparison.
So tell us a little bit then about the mechanism that they used in Chicago to distribute or coordinate a lot of this assistance.
Yeah, so this is the really exciting part of this research. So what was interesting about it is after the fire, actually as the fire was burning, this was one of the first nationally publicized natural disasters. And so you immediately had money that was coming into Chicago. And as it was coming in, what was interesting is that instead of the mayor of Chicago actually taking control of these funds that were coming in, the mayor did something very unique in that circumstance, and he turned over donations that were coming in. He turned over full authorization of the donations that were coming into Chicago to a private charitable organization. This was a group called the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. They were a group of very prominent elite figures in kind of the Chicago business world. And they had been operative in Chicago for a long time prior to the actual disaster, but they had been engaged in much more smaller level charitable, but general charitable giving. So what the mayor did is he took all of these funds that were coming in, and he, for political reasons and for perhaps capability reasons, he gave them the ability to kind of execute the relief effort using the donations that came into the city and kind of to take control over how this was going to
Tell
unfold.
us a little bit more about this Chicago Relief and Aid Society and their activities that they were doing before the fire,
Yeah.
because I think this is an important part of the story. This was an organization that was already in existence, right?
Yeah. So one of the things that maybe a lot of your viewers don't appreciate is that during this period in American history, you had all kinds of civil society organizations that were operative and doing all kinds of different things, providing mutual aid, providing insurance for particular members. Oftentimes these organizations would be organized either through ethnic or religious communities. But the unique aspect of the Chicago Relief and Aid Society is that they weren't involved in any kind of mutual insurance or mutual aid, and they really aimed at providing general poverty relief for the community of Chicago. So this is unique because they didn't discriminate based on race or ethnicity, which would otherwise would have been the case with kind of mutual aid societies. And they were really engaged in doing what was called outdoor relief at the time, aiding people who were down on their luck, who needed assistance. But this was temporary assistance. This was assistance that was designed to kind of get them back on their feet and being able to provide, and providing for women and children should they not have a male breadwinner at home at the time. So this was what they were engaged in prior to the Chicago fire, and they had been doing this for 20 or 30 years prior to the fire. So when this natural disaster hit and it's just completely ravages the city, they kind of step in to say, okay, well, we are a body that's been providing relief, given at a very small scale, to Chicago. We're going to kind of use our ties and our experience and our expertise on the ground to undertake this much broader relief effort.
And it's the records, the archives of this organization and what they were doing with all this money that you were able to use in your research, right?
Yeah. So what was really interesting about this organization, one of the problems with providing aid prior to natural disasters, but is made particularly acute in disaster situations as well, is what we call the Samaritans Dilemma. The Samaritans Dilemma is basically, while the Samaritan is in a position to want to give aid, by giving aid, you simultaneously undermine the recipient's incentives to undertake efforts to relieve their own situation. And it's a delicate balance because both the Samaritan and the recipient would like to, have some kind of relief, some type of aid assistance, but simultaneously you have this problem of undermining incentives. And so it's a tricky problem that plagues aid in a number of different circumstances. So what was interesting about looking at the Chicago Relief and Aid Society is that they had actually structured their organization using a constitutional set of rules to particularly address this problem of the Samaritans Dilemma. And so they set up their rule structure in such a way that the first challenge to overcoming the Samaritans Dilemma is you have to recognize that it exists. And so in their first law of their constitution, they recognize that there's this challenge of delivering aid, that if you provide these incentives, you have to kind of balance this in a number of different ways. So you want to adopt rules that are going to try to limit the scope for things like moral hazard problems or free riding on the part of agents. And that's particularly what they did with their constitutional structure.
We'll need to get into that a little bit more in a little more detail,
Yeah.
but these are some of the rules that, that they had for this society. Now, in one sense, Chicago wasn't necessarily particularly lucky to have a relief and aid society like this in existence when the fire happened to happen, because if you are relying on voluntary organizations to provide relief and bad things are happening, probably most cities around the country at that time had something like this Chicago Relief and Aid Society, right?
Yeah, I mean, the landscape of civil society associations across the United States at this time were overlapping in many different ways. So a particular person who was impacted by this disaster in Chicago may have been a member of a mutual aid association. They may have had a church Association that they were also part of, and then they were also perhaps impacted by the efforts of the Chicago Relief and Aid Society. And that overlapping kind of nature of how civil society worked extended throughout the U.S. at the time.
So then, how much, let's get into some of the specifics or some of the totals. Do you know how much aid the Relief and Aid Society was able to hand out or provide?
Yeah, so by contemporary standards, it would rival what, was, say, given after the Haiti earthquake recently. Here we have a few of the numbers that show when the donations came in and how much came in over time. What's noticeable here is the donations that came in the immediate aftermath of the fire came in very, very quickly. Within the first few weeks after the disaster, you had a substantial amount of resources that came flowing in. And within that first, October, the fire happened in October. It gets pretty cold in November and December in Chicago. And so the organization immediately had substantial resources to begin kind of administering aid right off the bat, but then those resources continued to come in over the relief period. And so overall, in 1871 dollars, I believe it was roughly less than $4 million.
Okay. And so you touched on this, but when we do research on disasters, we actually break down what happens after disaster into two sort of phases. One would be the immediate relief and response phase, and then we have a later recovery phase. So it sounds like the Relief and Aid Society got busy on the relief part, the initial response, pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, so essentially what they did is they had kind of very distinct things that they thought that they would do. And so they weren't trying to do everything at once, but they thought it was very important first to open up lines of communication and travel so that anyone who wanted to leave the city and go stay with family or relatives outside could do so and could travel free on the trains. Simultaneously, they were bringing in gifts in kind and resources into the city by opening up those railways free of charge, at least in the initial aftermath of the disaster. The other thing that they did is they focused explicitly on housing. So what they were able to do is provide what we would now call prefab housing packages. They put together what would be needed to construct a single family home, and they would distribute these houses to people who had lost title and had lost property. Now what was incredibly interesting about how they went about doing this is they had to figure out who was telling the truth and who was not telling the truth in terms of property claims, because in the fire, one of the things that burnt to the ground was the building that held all of the title and record to all of the property. So what they had to do is they had to utilize members of the external community to kind of figure out which claims were true and which claims were not true. So when someone would make a claim to a particular piece of property and for a housing construct, they would ask for letters from their immediate residents, from perhaps their pastor of their local church, to verify that claim was correct. Now, why this is important, from solving the Samaritans Dilemma problem, this essentially outsources the enforcement of the rules to the actual community itself, such that the donor doesn't have the incentive to continue to extend aid or to extend aid to the wrong persons after disaster. So they were using this community enforcement mechanism to try to uncover who had just title to particular claims and then to help those people get back on their feet.
And then also, were they doing this to decide who was going to get other types of assistance, if they were giving out food assistance and so forth, or clothing assistance?
Less so. It was very much, the property was a very, they used the community enforcement mechanism much more extensively in that regard. When it came to food and clothing, they were much more open door policy in the initial aftermath, because what they wanted to just make sure is that people had the clothing to get through the winter, they had the food and resources. So as you have up here, the Chicago Relief and Aid Society went from aiding roughly about 3,500 families prior to the actual disaster, and the average aid that they were giving was roughly about $25 in aid. So it was smaller packages of aid to a smaller number of families. In the aftermath of the disaster, that they went up to aiding over 40,000 families in the immediate aftermath, and the average paid package of aid was about $100. So the size and scope of their organization was incredibly flexible, such that they were able to ramp up aid production immediately and serve a wide variety of the population that was affected. And they were able to do so with much more generous aid packages.
So tell us, so where did this money come from? We've talked about how much they spent and how many families they were helping. Where did all this money come from?
So it came from a variety of different sources. It came from roughly half of the money was given by businesses, the other by local municipal governments. These would have been very small municipal governments that were making contributions on the part of their taxpayers. And then another third of the donations were coming from individuals, and these would range from very small donations all the way up to substantial contributions. But they were coming from all over the country, much more in the Northeast, so Pittsburgh, Boston, New York, in many of these areas that often had business or family connections to Chicago, they were sending in resources. But you even see contributions coming from London, England.
And so there was some government assistance that was coming in from other cities across the country. So I think if I remember reading it in your paper, it was like in Boston or something, like they decided that they would make a donation. The city of Boston decided that they would make a donation to Chicago relief effort, right?
Yeah. And so one of the challenges in terms of looking at how disaster relief took place when you don't have an overarching federal government, one of the arguments is always, well, the speed of overcoming the collective action problem of actually sending donations is a key factor. One of the things that comes out of my research is that municipal governments didn't really face this type of problem. They could make decisions on the spot whether or not to send money or not. But businesses and individuals also didn't wait. They were very quick to give aid as well. And so it didn't seem as if the collective action problem, even on the part of businesses that actually went to their board of directors or went to their board of trade and said, should we give, how much should we give, it was a very expedient process. And so you had a very substantial amount of money that was coming from a variety of different sources.
And it was a very different model in that, unlike with the federal government, where they're actually coming in and trying to distribute the aid themselves, the cities across the country simply sent aid. It went money. It went to the Chicago Relief and Aid Society, and then they took advantage of the society's distribution.
Knowledge and distribution networks and decision making on what things were important, who needed what, where, and how. And what was interesting about the actual relief effort that the society orchestrated, if you look at the actual distribution of resources, one of the things that one would be concerned of in this case is that you have an elite group of businessmen who may privilege particular groups, but in actuality, from everything that we can tell, it was the disproportionate immigrant groups who were burnt out of the fire the worst. They received it more than proportionate amounts of relief efforts. So you don't seem, at least on face value, there doesn't seem to be any systematic discrimination in the way in which these funds were spent, which is something we would care about after disaster.
So the Relief and Aid Society was using their connections or their ties to the community, and from an economic standpoint, when we look at it as economists, we would say that they would be using some local knowledge, and that raises the whole point about what this local knowledge is. It's very important in our economics discussion. So if you could tell us a little bit about local knowledge and how we as economists have come to understand this.
Yeah, so one of the things that's amazing about how markets work, especially after disaster, is when prices rise, they provide both an incentive and a signal to what types of resources are needed, where they're needed, in what magnitudes, and they provide that signal to precisely those people who are in a position to be able to act on it. And so that's one of the beauties of markets that we have. After disasters, you have oftentimes, if markets are not prevented from working, they're doing a lot of this signaling as to where resources are needed and in what quantities. But in the same way, when you have other types of goods and other types of relief efforts that need to be coordinated, it's very important that the people on the ground who know what things are needed, where they're needed, are given the tools to be able to act on that type of information. So oftentimes local knowledge is tacit. It has to do with understanding the actual context of the disaster, knowing what the populations are. And so when people are on the ground, they have a lot of knowledge that oftentimes cannot be sent up to a kind of a central decision-making mechanism in an expedient or even effective way.
And there's this picture here of the Nobel Prize winning economist who was sort of the pioneer in recognizing this nature, this nature of economic knowledge, right?
Yeah. So this is Hayek's, one of F.A. Hayek's central ideas about both, how markets actually work to coordinate this local knowledge, to allow people who both have the incentive but also have the information to be able to act on it in such a way that provides benefits that ripple throughout the system.
Another Nobel Prize winner emphasized the need to have local organizations to be able to use a lot of this local knowledge, right?
Yes. So Elinor Ostrom's work is very important to this story because she emphasizes how the contextual nature of knowledge will also influence the variety of different organizational structures and institutions that emerge to cope with all kinds of problems like natural disasters or common pool resource problems, as she emphasized in much of her research. And so these ideas are complementary in how we understand how various different institutions can function to solve large-scale and complex public goods problems. I mean, part of Hayek's insight that overlaps with Ostrom's is that these situations are highly complex and they require that people who are in the right position to be able to have the knowledge and to act on it are empowered to do so.
So the Chicago fire happened a long time ago, and so you might even want to say it's like ancient history. Do you think there are any lessons for disaster relief policy today from this historical example?
I think there's really important lessons, especially when we look at disasters in countries that don't have well-functioning governments or don't have a lot of state capacity. Oftentimes there are institutions and efforts that are undertaken from a bottom-up level that are capable of solving these types of problems, and it's incumbent upon us as researchers to actually go out and understand how these systems work before we try to kind of impose our own ideas about how they should work from an outsider's perspective. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done to see how these types of response systems can work and oftentimes don't work in a variety of different contexts.
Well, thanks very much for coming on. I think it's been an interesting conversation. I've enjoyed your research on this topic over the years. So thanks for coming on.
Dan, it was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.